Hey guys, welcome to That Florida Feeling. Hope everybody's having a good week. I am sure that, like me, you guys are watching the Atlantic, and everybody is yelling pivot at this hurricane, because that's a monster, and I don't want that to hit anybody. But it is hurricane season, so keep an eye on the weather and be prepared. Thanks to everybody who's interacted with the Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok pages. As always, you guys are awesome. YouTube is still a work in progress. I'm kind of feeling good about my shorts. Kind of don't know about my videos, but you know what? We're working on it, and we're getting there. Shout out to Ryan. He was talking to me on Facebook about the Vernon episode. I appreciate it. You're awesome. Shout out to you for being an amazing human being, and thank you for supporting the podcast. Thanks to everybody, actually, who supports the podcast. I couldn't do this without you guys. So, today, so let me start. Me and one of my friends were actually discussing, as Dahlia was coming to Florida, and, brought up that if you live in Florida, you've heard randomly, probably many times, at least once every hurricane season, especially living in Tampa, that parts of Florida are protected by Indian blessings burial mounds. And Jamie brought this up to me, and she was like, well, do you know anything about this? What have you heard about this? And I mean, of course, if you've lived in Florida during hurricane season, you've probably heard about this, especially living in Tampa, Sarasota. There's some parts on the East Coast. And so, having heard about the cone of safety in the Tampa area, why not see what this really is? And of course, since it is hurricane season and there's a few months, and we've had Idalia make landfall in Big Bend, and the Atlantic is obviously still very active, let's look into this. I mean, we know to make preparations and evacuate if needed be, but what about the people before us? How did the Native Americans shelter the storms or ride them out, or how did they prepare, or did they know they were coming? So I thought this would make some really interesting research. And is there truth behind the Indian mounds and the blessings and the burial mounds to whether or not that protects, namely Tampa Bay, Sarasota, and other parts of Florida? So the Native Americans, first and foremost, were taught to have reverence for nature. They even have a deep connection to it. They appreciate it. They honor it. They respect nature. So they may not have feared natural disasters and storms like we do, but instead they respected it as a part of life, as a way nature reacted to whatever was going on. One of the things I was researching actually quoted and writing, our ancestors, the Seminole and Miccosukee, were not taught to fear the hurricane. The generations of people today need to remember and share the stories with younger generations so they will respect and love the natural world. And stating that this is part of nature and that tribes respected and understood that this is just how nature happened. And I kind of understand that, because there weren't satellites and radars and planes that flew through. But they knew. They still somehow just knew when things were happening. Of course, the 1700s were tough years as the Native Americans were displaced from their natural homelands in northern Florida and parts of Georgia. And this, of course, is where the Seminole, the Miccosukee, and the Creek tribes were pushed into South Florida and kind of became the Seminole tribe. This action actually is the direct result of the Seminole Wars. That's what caused them, and ultimately the Native Americans did find refuge in the swamps of South Florida. And actually there's still a couple of reservations down there to this day. The Native Americans, though, had been living in Florida for generations before the white settlers came and understood well and kind of almost could predict when hurricanes and tropical storms were coming, and that was so that they could protect themselves from these natural disasters. Of course, they had many different ways of telling if hurricanes were near. One sign was that sawgrass was blooming. They believed that only certain atmospheric changes, like major hurricanes, would actually set off the bloom a few days before the arrival of a hurricane. So they would see this and they would head inland to protect themselves off the path of a hurricane. I think that's very interesting, especially when you pay attention to nature. Nature kind of warns you about what's coming. It's like when you look at the sky and you see it's green, that's probably a tornado. It's kind of the same prediction, kind of the same. If you just pay attention to the weather and nature surrounding you, it'll probably give you a heads up as to what's going on. I did find some really cool stuff in my research. Betty Osceola, a member of the Miccosukee tribe and the Panther clan, actually was quoted sharing stories from her childhood after Irma had actually hit the state, and how her family had weathered storms for years. So I'm going to read you some excerpts of her talking about her childhood. Many years ago, when my late father-in-law was young, maybe 10, they were out in the Everglades gathering crops, and the elders kept looking at the sky. They were talking about a big wind that was coming. And of course, the wind started to pick up, and everybody that was out in the Everglades that were stuck on the islands where they had been gathering was pretty much stuck. So they knew they had to protect themselves. They drug their canoes onto land and began to secure them in place. They crawled under a made roof and canoes and huddled together. The winds began to howl. They felt the winds blow through the made shelters. The shelter her family was under at the time that her family talked about was a chickee hut. And a chickee hut's just like a thatched shelter, and it sits on legs. And they had taken the legs off and laid the roof on the ground so that they were protected. They could hear the trees crashing around them and, of course, being afraid that one would fall on them. And hours passed before the winds and the rain stopped and they could come out of their shelter. When they looked out, the land had been flattened around them. And, of course, they made sure that everybody was okay. He told of one man who had gone to hunt and got caught in the hurricane. He was able to shelter under his dugout canoe. He hadn't seen animals before the storm, but as he was coming back to the others, he found deer and birds that he was able to bring back. That there shows that nature warns itself. Animals flee in bad weather. You know, if you watch the cows, you can tell when it's going to snow or rain because of how they react. So it's not surprising that birds and deer would have reacted the same to get out of the storm. Betty was also quoted as saying the elders always knew. They had knowledge and connection to the land to care for themselves and their people. The Creator kept them safe and always provided nourishment after the lands were washed. She also shared her mother's stories, who was raised by her grandparents. They were caught in hurricanes and took shelter under a chickee hut, where the people had tied themselves to the poles to keep the hut together. She even spoke about how her mother had dealt with tornadoes in the past. She told about how her mom traveled in much of Florida, and most of it was undeveloped at the time her mother was traveling. And they would watch the weather as it changed in a minute in Florida. And of course, if you've lived in Florida, you know that afternoon storms pop up out of nowhere and move away just as quickly. She said that her mother remembers her grandfather getting them out of the canoe, beaching the canoe, and putting them under the canoe to protect themselves from whatever's coming. The storms passed and they were okay thanks to her grandfather being aware of the weather, his quick actions, and noticing the changes. Betty herself shared her experience from Hurricane Andrew in 1992. Hurricane Andrew was a monster storm, and she had her husband and 2 young children, and they were living in the Everglades. They were told that they needed to leave Florida, but they stayed. And in fact, compared to Miami, where they had been staying in the Everglades, had actual minimal damage. They were in an undeveloped area in the Native American territory, and she remembers everyone telling them they need to leave the territory, they need to seek shelter, they need to protect themselves, they have kids. But Betty didn't live with running water or electricity, and everyone wanted them to leave because of their kids. But they kept wanting them to leave because of what was coming, but also because of what they were going to lose once the storm came. Betty stated that she was already living without these necessities and continued living without them, so she wasn't going to lose anything if the storm did take out utilities. She already didn't have them. She didn't lose anything to Andrew because the chickees were still standing. They had a way to get food. They had a way to get clean water. They had firewood that they could use to cook. She was in tune with nature, and she knew that after the storm passed, everything would still be okay. That is a really cool testament to hurricanes, tornadoes, passing down of generations, and how people are in tune with nature and the land. And it's really amazing to think that people live like that to this day. They're self-reliant. They notice things probably before we notice things. They understand things that we don't because of their way of life, and that includes understanding when weather is going to change for the good or for the bad. The Native Americans have lived in Florida long before the settlers arrived, and they had survived. But did they survive with some extra help? Irma bared down into Florida as a Cat 4, Cat 5 storm in 2017, and it was a bad storm. I remember this storm. It was bad. People were fleeing. We got stuck on 95 for 16 hours. In fact, that actually just came up in my Facebook memories because it was about this time, 5 years ago. Yeah, it was today, 5 years ago. We were fleeing from Irma. People lost everything. Power was out for weeks. We were, I think, 10 days without power. Food was scarce in some places. I will tell you, I have never enjoyed a pizza more than Hungry Howie's on a limited menu after not having power for 6 days. And when we did get power, that was some of the best macaroni and cheese I've ever had in my life. But it was devastating. Irma devastated Florida. And some places were left with minimal problems. But was this because of the path of the storm, or because something might have steered the storm away? You live in Florida, and like I said, we've all heard these stories about areas that are protected by Native American blessings or spirits that can stop certain parts of the state from being devastated by hurricanes. Sarasota, Tampa, most of Pinellas County, Brevard County, and a few others, just to name a few, always seem to be right in the path, only for that last-minute curve. Ian, last year, Ian was coming right for Tampa Bay, and at the last minute it curved, And Tampa Bay is one of those areas where it always seems to be okay after the storm comes through. Yes, they get damage, they get wind, they get flooding. It flooded after Idalia. But there's never a direct hit, and there's never any true problems. And honestly, people think that Native Americans that protected these areas long ago, and the protection still stands to this day. Sarasota is another place that's not been directly hit since keeping records in 1871. Tampa has avoided a direct hit in over 100 years in other areas nearby. Now, they still get the outer bands, like I said, but they always seem to dodge that bullet of a direct hit, eye over land type of hurricane experience. Ian and Idalia are the prime examples of this in the past few years. Ian had Tampa dead to rights and shifted further south, still missing Sarasota. Irma was the same. Irma was going to hit, Irma's path, they thought it was going to hit every part of the state, and it came up right through Naples and missed Tampa completely. Everybody in the areas have heard these legends, but where did they come from? Is it a blessing? Is it protections based on these Indian mounds? Maybe. Maybe not. There is a story that comes from 1906, and it was actually a love story to explain how Sarasota got its name. And many people believe that story is also where people get the idea that it's from protection. The story was made up that Sarah DeSoto fell in love with a Native American prince, and they fell in love. It's a true love story, but unfortunately, things happened. The prince fell ill, and Sarah nursed him back to health, and then unfortunately, Sarah fell ill, but the prince couldn't nurse her back to health. And when she died, the prince asked Hernando DeSoto, her father, to choose her resting place, and he chose Sarasota Bay. And he put her out in a canoe, and the canoe obviously was sunk for her to have a resting place there. And as she sank, he went down with the ship, essentially. He chopped up his canoe with all of his men, and they all sank to the bottom of Sarasota Bay. The spirit still protects the bay from storms and bad things due to their love. Now, the problem is that DeSoto didn't have any kids, and he certainly didn't bring kids with him when he was exploring the New World. It's a great story, and it's a fun one to explain how Sarasota got its name. But it's made up. But what about Tampa? Why is it protected? Tampa was home to many different tribes, such as the Tocobaga and the Safety Harbor culture, and the Seminoles at one time. The area is home to many burial grounds, and many believe that's why it hasn't been hit by a major hurricane in over 100 years. The legend of the Tocobaga inhabiting the coastline of Tampa Bay is not just a legend, it's history. It's fact. They lived on fish and shellfish as they thrived on the bay's shores, and they lived peacefully so until the Spanish came, where most of them died off due to disease and war. They were thought to be wiped out by the 1800s, but they had already built burial mounds all over Tampa as they clung to civilization. In fact, you can actually see one of the largest burial mounds in Safety Harbor in Pinellas County. It is actually in Felipe Park. I know that Christina is going to correct me on my pronunciation. Felipe, however you want to say it, Park in Safety Harbor. You can actually walk up to this burial mound. You can walk up to the top of it, and you can see absolutely gorgeous views of that part of Tampa Bay. But those mounds are what is said to be the zone of safety, what protects Tampa and possibly Sarasota. And the zone of safety, or the circle of safety, has had many glancing blows, even a brush with Irma, who was a Cat 1 by the time it hit Tampa in the last 100 years. Charlie, Francis, Etta, Ian, Idalia, many others have come into the circle, but Tampa and most of the circle have never had a direct hit in over 100 years. People believe that this is the reason for Tampa and the area in the circle being spared. I think there's something to it as well. I mean, I watched Irma strike much further south than originally thought, and Ian turned at the last minute. Idalia, most recently, was coming and went west and north. Now, I'm not sure that the Native Americans intended for the white people who settled their lands from them to be protected, but if they did put something to protect themselves all those years ago, I can assure you that having lived there through hurricane season, I am thankful for it, and I'm sure that most people are to this day. But of course, Tampa isn't the only area to be protected from these blessings. Brevard County on the other coast has never had a direct hit from a hurricane, but like Tampa has had some come super incredibly close. But who's looking out for Brevard County? Sam Houston, an original settler in the area, told anybody that would listen that Brevard County was protected and totally because of the past Florida natives. The legend goes that the Ayes Indians blessed the area to protect their burial grounds, and one of those large grounds actually sits on Kennedy Space Center's most northern lands. People in Brevard County, of course, have been building on these lands for years, and there have actually been several Ayes burial and ritual grounds in the county found as a result of, new buildings, new constructions, new homes, people moving to the area. Residents in the area think that part of the reason that Brevard County is often spared from major hurricanes is because of these blessings that were laid down so many years ago. People still find pottery in the area as a reminder that someone else did settle here first and someone else did survive just as much as we are. Unfortunately, the Ayes were gone by the 1700s thanks to many of the same reasons the Tocobaga were by the 1800s. They left behind burial grounds, ceremonial grounds, and many other things that showed they lived a full and happy life on the coast. They may have loved the land just as we do today, and they may have wanted to keep it protected for many of their generations, and we're still enjoying those benefits today. That may be why the Brevard County has had so many near misses thanks to the Ayes tribe. It may be the same reason that Tampa and Sarasota are still enjoying, their zone of safety, thanks to the Tocobaga. Do we know why certain parts of Florida get hit worse than others? No, not really. Is the Bay there to protect Tampa or the Gulf Stream to protect Brevard County? Maybe. But I like to think that the people who were here before us loved this area as much as we do today. They were more in tune with nature, though, the lands, and they cared more about it. And maybe they really did want to keep it for future generations. I just hope that, honestly, no one in Florida deals with any storms anymore this hurricane season. I hope they all go swinging out into the Atlantic to fizzle out into whatever. We do need to remember that this is hurricane season, and you've still got to stay prepared, especially with monster storms like Lee out there right now. You need water, food, pet supplies, medicines, batteries, and other things to make it a few days or a week or a couple weeks without power. But what you don't need to do is to shoot at a hurricane. Shooting at a hurricane does not stop a hurricane. Also remember, what goes up must come down. Florida Man created a Facebook event during Irma where people were supposed to go outside and shoot at the hurricane to make it go away. Obviously, that is not a good idea. They did actually have to tell people not to do this. I remember watching the news, and even Grady Judd was out there like, do not do this. This is stupid. First of all, it doesn't help. And secondly, again, what goes up must come down. Usually not the same place you fired it. So, I hope you guys have enjoyed learning about one of Florida's myths and legends, one that I actually fully believe in. I think that the people who were here before us somehow are still helping us to this day. Just remember, guys, stay prepared for a few more months. It's almost over, but we are in September, and we still have October and November to worry about. I appreciate you guys listening. Check out the social media pages. If you have any topics you want to hear, please let me know. I got all the topics from Instagram that you guys suggested, and don't worry, those are coming up very soon. Thanks for listening. I hope you guys have a great week. Drink your water, wear your sunscreen, and as always, guys, that's your daily dose of sunshine.